So it is the closest election in U.S. history between Democrat current Vice President Kamala Harris and Republican former President Donald Trump. Less than 1% separates the two of them in the latest Real Clear polls that have come out. This is closer than what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 election cycles. In fact, if you have to see an election that is closer than this, you have to go all the way back 24 years to the year 2000 in the infamous Bush versus Gore election, which ultimately, of course, was decided in the Supreme Court. But let's try and make sense of this, because there are very real-world consequences for whoever becomes the next US president, not just domestically in the United States. India is watching this very closely. This is being watched right around the world, from Beijing to Moscow to London, because there are consequences for who becomes the next US president. Let's try and make sense of this by speaking to someone who knows a thing or two about US elections. He's been talking about it, he's been researching, writing about it for the better part of the last 40 years. Professor John Mearsheimer from the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago. Thank you very much, Professor, and good to see you as we count down to the US election.
Good to see you.
All right, let's start with, if you could explain to our viewers sitting here in India, because there's a lot of interest, in the US election, who's going to win, who has the edge. First things first, why is this election so darn close?
Well, you want to remember that the 2020 election was close, and the 2016 election was close as well. And I think that what you have here is a situation where the electorate is by and large split in half. And when you look at the 7 swing states that really matter, it's almost impossible to tell who's ahead in each of those 7 swing states. So predicting who's going to win this election is almost impossible.
Do you reckon, because it's such a close race and it boils down to, like you said, about half a dozen swing states, what actually matters is who's got better organizing on the ground, who turns out the vote more, who mobilizes better on the day, and perhaps now because of early voting in the days leading up to?
I think that matters, but it's not apparent that either side has an advantage in that front. I mean, both sides understand full well that in a remarkably close election like this, mobilizing your supporters and getting out the vote matters enormously. So both sides are hard at work on this front. I think both sides are doing everything possible to, eke out a victory here. There's no question about that.
The problem, though, for Harris is she seems to be sort of flattening out at around 49%. And Trump, the lead between Trump and Harris, let's say around the time of the debate, which happened a little over a month ago, and right after that, Harris got a bump. She was leading by over 2%. Right now, it's less than 8%. She seems to not be the candidate who has momentum. Trump, on the other hand, seems to be the one who's got tailwind behind him. Would that be concerning if you're in the Harris campaign running up to Election Day, in the lead up to Election Day?
Yes, I think so. But if Trump has a tailwind behind him, it's a tiny tailwind. It's not, as far as the polls are concerned, propelling him ahead of her in any meaningful way. I was looking at a New York Times poll that covered the 7 swing states, and they were in a dead tie in 4 of those states. And in 2 of the states, Trump had a tiny lead, which I think was statistically insignificant. And then in one other state, Harris had a statistically insignificant lead. So if Trump has a tailwind, it's not doing that much for him. I think if you're going to make the case for Trump, that Trump is likely to win this, has to be the argument that lots of people who do not respond to pollsters are Trump supporters who just are afraid to make it clear that they're Trump supporters. And furthermore, a lot of people who respond to pollsters and say they're undecided are really Trump supporters, but they're afraid to say that. And one has the sense, it's just a sense, that there are a good number of people out there who are Trump supporters who the polls are not capturing. And many people believe that this is what happened in 2016 and what happened in 2020. You want to remember, in both of those cases going into the election, it looked like Trump was in much worse shape than turned out to be the case after people went to the polling booth. And this is the argument that it's hard to say publicly in certain states and in certain quarters that you're a Trump supporter, even though once you get in the polling booth, you'll pull the lever for him.
So I had Professor Lichtman on the show earlier this week from the American University. He's, of course, the man with the famous keys. He had an interesting take on this, the undercounting of the Trump vote. He said that was true in 2016 because a lot of people did not want to be seen as, voting for Trump. He was an unknown commodity at that time. But he says it's less true of the 2020 election and more certainly of the 2024 election. He also had an interesting theory. He says, just like the Republican vote was undercounted in 2016, he reckons the Democratic vote is going to be undercounted in 2024. And he says primarily that is women who are not speaking to pollsters, or women who are motivated enough because of the abortion issue, who are coming out and voting against Trump, who may have normally voted Republican, but are not voting for Trump this time because of that issue.
Well, there's no question that there is a male-female divide here, and men tend to be much more supportive of Trump, and women tend to be much more supportive of Harris. There's no question that is true. But the issue here is whether the polls are missing that, and on election day, we're going to see results that don't mesh with what we see in the polls now regarding men and women. And I don't think that's the case. I think the polls are pretty much capturing the female-male divide at this point in time. The point I was making had to do with Trump supporters. I do believe that there are a good number of people out there who I interact with who are going to vote for Trump, but do not say that to me because in the circles I move in, saying that you're a Trump supporter is not a smart thing to do. It's not politically correct.
So let me come to what the implications or the down the line fallout would be if Trump becomes president or Harris becomes president. Let's start with India. I know there is a sort of bipartisan consensus on the Hill when it comes to India, but surely administrations and the personality of the occupant of the White House makes a difference. Who do you reckon would be viewed more favorably from New Delhi's point of view between Trump and Harris?
I think probably it would be Trump, because I think ideologically the Modi government is more in sync with Trump than with Harris. But I think regardless of who gets elected in the United States, it will have little effect on U.S.-Indian relations. I don't see any evidence that the two candidates are interested in pursuing foreign policies that would lead them to have different approaches for dealing with New Delhi.
All right, Professor John Mearsheimer. Final question. I mean, I don't know if you're a betting man, but if you are, who would your bet be on Harris or on Trump?
If I had to bet, I would bet on Trump. Okay. My guess is, and it's just a guess, that Harris will win the popular vote, but in the 7 swing states that really matter, Trump will eke out a narrow victory. As I said before, I think it's likely that there are a number of people who are Trump supporters who are not saying so. And I think they'll vote for him when the time comes, and that will put him over the top. But my guess would be not by much.
All right. Professor John Mearsheimer, it's always a pleasure speaking with you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us here on CNN News 18.
You're more than welcome.
The oracle of American elections, Professor Alan Lichtman from the American University, is now joining us. Thank you very much, Professor, for speaking with us. Good to see you, as always. When we spoke last, I think it was in August, and you had just come out with your announcement with the keys, and you said in 2024, your prediction was that Kamala Harris would win the 2024 election. Are you sticking to your prediction, particularly given how the gap seems to be narrowing, particularly in the last few weeks? It seems like Kamala Harris is finding it much tougher today than when you made your prediction back in August.
My prediction has nothing to do with the polls. That's the mistake a lot of people make. You can take those polls and do with them what the great British philosopher David Hume said, you should do the works of superstition, consign them to the flames. They're all noise because the error margin is vastly greater than the pollsters would tell you. They tell you, you've heard this, it's plus and minus 3%, right?
Hmm.
That's pure statistical error. That's the error you would get if you had a huge jar of green and red balls and you pulled out a sample to estimate the percentage of green and red balls in the jar. But human beings are not green and red balls. They don't respond to pollsters. They may lie. The election is not held today. They're going to change their minds. And the pollsters have no idea who's actually going to vote. They have to guess at the likely voters. That at least doubles the error margin to at least plus and minus 6%, which is a 12-point gap. It has to be 12 points or more. And that additional error is not random. In 2016, the polls underestimated Republican voting strength, which is why, in defiance of the polls, I predicted Trump's win, even got a letter of congratulations from him after that prediction. But based on what we've seen in 2022 to 2024, the polls are now underestimating Democratic voting strength. Look, I know the media has to slavishly follow the polls. You have to tell a story every single day. You got to make believe the election is a horse race with the pollsters keeping score. But my system transcends all that. It's based upon the presumption that elections are driven by the strength and performance of the White House party. That's why I introduced my prediction before the so-called Harris-Trump pivotal debate that the pundits were talking about.
Yeah. But tell me this, Professor, you base your predictions not on any of these polls, but the answers to your 13 true or false questions, or keys as you call them, the 13 keys to the White House. And you've recently even got into a bit of a scruff with some traditional pollsters, the likes of Nate Silver, etc., who you have called a compiler of polls, a clerk. Why would you say that your model is better than that of, so many political scientists, data crunchers, the likes of Nate Silver, and there's millions of dollars backing the polling industry?
Simple reason, track record. I've been right for 42 years since I predicted Ronald Reagan's reelection in April 1982, nearly 3 years ahead of time when 60% of Americans said he was too old to run again, and his approval ratings were down in the dumps. I defied all the pollsters, all the pundits in predicting Donald Trump in 2016. Remember what Nate Silver told us? Depending on the time of day you checked in with him, he said there was, a 70 to 80% chance Hillary Clinton would win the election. Then when she lost, he said, see, I told you there was a 20% plus chance that she would lose. If you can't be wrong, you also can't be right. My predictions are definitive. I tell you who's going to win or lose. My predictions are totally nonpartisan. I've predicted the two most conservative presidents of our time, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, and liberals like Barack Obama. Can I be wrong? Of course. I'm a human being. Any human being can be wrong, although no one has a 42-year track record. Maybe we've just outlived everyone else. My predictions are based on also 160 years of historical patterns. Retrospectively in development, I've gone all the way back to 1860, when we had no radio, no television, no automobiles, no planes, no polls. Women couldn't vote. African Americans were enslaved. We were an agricultural society. So the polls have survived enormous changes in our, the keys, enormous changes.
Most Americans feel like they are worse off economically today than they were 4 years ago.
Look, based on the economy, Hillary Clinton should have won in a landslide in 2016. The economy was doing incredibly well. Based on the economy, Hubert Humphrey in 1968 should have won in a landslide. It was the best economy we've ever had. That's just two keys out of 13. You can't just isolate two of the keys. If you want to develop your own political system just based on polling on the economy, go right ahead. I get this all the time. But I have never seen a system that's successful actually in doing that. And again, you haven't responded to my critical point, which is you have vastly underplayed the danger that Trump poses to our future democracy
But
as
explain
compared
this to
to
me.
minor things you talk
Explain this
about
to
for
me
Harris.
as to why you think that is the number one issue concerning ordinary Americans in this election.
If it isn't, the press has tremendous amount to blame. You're going to need to look in the mirror if Trump wins, because you're not going to have a free press anymore. Remember, his model is Hungary, where there is no free press and no free opposition. You're going to have to look long and hard in the mirror and explain why you failed to really, in incredibly important ways, point out the danger that Trump poses.
Okay, so final part of the interview as we come to the conclusion.
Sure.
I'm going to read out your 13 keys for true or false, and then we're going to see, if anything has changed between August when you made your first prediction for Kamala Harris. Here are your keys. Key number
Sure.
1: incumbent party mandate. So is that a yes or a no for Harris?
No.
Number 2: nomination contest. There is no serious contest for the incumbent party nomination. Is that
That's
a yes?
yes.
That's a yes. So that's one key. Incumbency. The incumbent party candidate is the sitting president. That's a no.
No.
All right. The third party. There are no significant third party or independent campaigns. We did see RFK Jr., but he's now supporting Trump. You don't think that's going to make a difference?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
He's down around 1 or 2%, and just because he's supporting Trump is meaningless. And that's not the definition of the key. I've got to say, every single day, I get a host of emails of people saying they know better how to define my keys than I do. But my keys, if you want to use my system, you've got to stick to keys that have stood the test of time for 160 years. If you want to talk about some other way of looking at elections, I welcome it. I encourage it. But if you're going to use my system, you got to stick to how I define the keys. And by the way, none of these critics ever developed their own system.
So let me run through the rest of them. Short-term economy, long-term economy. Both yes for Harris?
Yes.
Policy change, social unrest, and scandal.
Yes.
All three of them.
Yes.
Foreign or military failure, foreign or military success.
Split, a no and a yes.
And then incumbent charisma and challenger charisma.
Incumbent charisma is a no. Challenger charisma is a yes.
So how many keys are a yes? And you say you have to get more than 7 to win?
It's 9-4.
It's 9-4. So Harris gets 9 keys, and therefore, as per the Alan Lichtman keys to the White House, she wins the White House. Okay.
That's my prediction. Can I be wrong? Of course. There can be such cataclysmic and unprecedented changes that can overturn 160 years pattern of history. I'm not psychic Gene Dixon with a crystal ball. I'm not Speaker Mike Johnson, who thinks the Almighty speaks to him. The problem is you can't know in advance whether the pattern that's held since the mid-19th century is going to change.
We will speak to you hopefully on the 6th of November, the day after the election, and see if the Alan Lichtman 13 keys to the White House still hold true and whether your prediction of Kamala Harris winning the White House does indeed come true. Thank you very much in the meanwhile for joining us, Professor.
Thank you. Great interview. Take care.
Fareed Zakaria, thank you very much for speaking with us here on CNN News 18.
My pleasure, Zakka.
Fareed, let's start off by asking you that simple question. Why is this contest so close? It's literally a knife's edge. Less than 1% separates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And at this point, 2 weeks out from the election, any of these possibilities can happen or come true on November 5th. Trump could win the White House, Harris could win the White House, and we could have a situation where Harris wins the popular vote but loses the White House.
It's a very good question, Zakka, and I think there are two answers to it. One is that for the last generation, for 25 years, the United States has had very close elections, very evenly split. If you remember, 25 years ago was the Bush-Gore election, 2024 years ago. And that election was decided by 536 votes in Florida. Uh, Other than Obama's first victory, which was a landslide, every election really has been very close. So the country is divided about evenly and has been for a long time. And so this is, in some sense, one more reflection of that very divided country. I think the second answer to it is, and which is must be what a lot of people are thinking around the world, is how can Donald Trump be so close given all the complications, the two impeachments, what happened on January 6th of 2020? So the answer is, I think, there. Donald Trump has figured out a way to speak for a large group of people in the United States who feel kind of dispossessed by the current order. And these people tend to be more disproportionately non college educated, white, rural voters. Now, that's not the only part of Trump's base, but that is the core of his base, and that has stayed with him no matter what. And because they view him as, yes, he may be flawed as a character, but he fights for them, and that sense is remarkably strong and resilient. And in fact, the more Trump gets attacked, the more his base doubles down on him. That is the phenomenon which I think is new and, I have to be honest, is almost unique. I've rarely seen an American politician who has that loyal a base.
Uh, let's talk about early voting, and they say that it's not necessarily connected to eventually how on voting day America tends to vote, but early voting generally tends to favor the Democrats. In 2020, you had historic numbers of early voters, largely driven by the COVID virus, which was very much active when the 2020 election happened. This time, I believe in some states like Georgia, it is at record numbers. In some other states, you're seeing a significant fall from 2020. Would you read too much into that?
I wouldn't, Zakka, and everybody now, because the race is so tight, everyone is searching for clues. It's like astrology at this point. Everyone is trying to find something that can tell them something. You put it exactly right. The truth is, 2020 was very unusual because of COVID. So large numbers of people voted. It was also very unusual because it kind of got wrapped up with partisan politics, with Democrats urging that people vote by mail in, Republicans saying don't do it. This time around, the Republicans have stopped saying don't do it, even though Trump every now and then casts aspersions on the early voting or on the mail in balloting. So it's sufficiently messy as a result that I suspect that, first of all, there won't be a very clear pattern that'll vary state to state. And I think it's probably somewhat unpredictable. There are a lot of signs that actually this time the mail in ballots may be roughly the same. Maybe, if you look at the people who are registered Republicans versus registered Democrats, they seem to be voting in some states in roughly equal numbers. All of which is to say, I think this is again what it's like reading the chicken entrails if you're an astrologer. I think best to just, I know it's very tempting to believe you have found some early sign. My own guess is we're going to have to wait till November 5th. And by the way, we may have to wait many days longer than November 5th. You said we won't know until November 5th. I think if we're lucky, we'll know on November 5th. This thing could go on for some days after the election.
And the other big sort of divide is right down gender lines. I mean, if the ABC News Ipsos poll says when it comes to women, they're voting 60-40 in favor of Harris, and men, it's the almost other way around. It's 57 in favor of Trump and 38 to Harris. So again, is that because abortion is a real big talking point in this campaign cycle, or is this, again, something, a new age divide that we're having to contend with in the American electorate?
I think this may be one of those new alignments. Gender may be one of the biggest ones on which people are splitting. You have the numbers exactly right. And I think you can see it in a way in which the rhetoric of the two parties, right? The rhetoric of the Democratic Party is so much around women's rights, women's bodies, women's opportunities. They have, after all, nominated a woman. And on the Republican side, there is much more of that, not just male, but traditional male. The emphasis on it. If you listen to Trump recently, he was going on and on about the golfer Arnold Palmer. And he kept talking about how he was all man. And of course, being Trump, he couldn't stop himself from being vulgar about it and talking about what Arnold Palmer looks like in the locker room when he's showering. But think about the Republican National Convention, where they had Hulk Hogan, this big wrestler, rip his shirt off. The symbolic message being sent is we are comfortable with very traditional men and male imagery and male symbolism, right? So that is turning out to be one of these new divides.
All right. Fareed Zakaria, as always, a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us and putting your thoughts into perspective for our viewers. Thank you.